The cry of the missing man. It was well past midnight. The town was wrapped in its usual silence. Moonlight filtered through the abandoned houses, casting faint light on the dirt roads. But tonight, something else was in the woods on the outskirts of town. No one truly knew what it was, but it had been a year since Mark Stevens went missing. A few weeks after Mark went missing, something began to happen. Every night, terrifying screams echoed from deep in the woods. Mark's family was driven nearly mad with fear as the screams seemed to come from the exact spot where he disappeared. Then, a small group of brave townsfolk secretly decided to track down the source of the eerie cries. Only one would return, Daniel. That night, the group walked down an old path on the outskirts of the town. They saw silhouettes ahead. But just as Daniel spoke, a scream echoed behind them, so close. And then, everything changed. Daniel noticed someone was coming toward them, Mark Stevens. But this wasn't the Mark they knew. His face was deformed, his eyes almost entirely white. Mark let out a scream, and the group turned and fled. Daniel kept walking toward him. Then, everything went black. A new scream, a chorus of voices, filled the woods. From that night onward, no one dared to go near that forest. A year later, the townspeople found a strange new addition to the cemetery, names of everyone who had gone missing. The source of the cries came from much closer than they realized. The man in the window. It was a rainy evening when Sarah first noticed the man in the window. She had just moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The first few days were uneventful, save for the creaks and groans of the house. But on the fourth night, everything changed. Sarah saw him, a man standing across the street just outside her window. He wasn't moving, just staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. She quickly pulled the curtains shut, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The next morning, Sarah called the police. The officer found something strange about the house next door. That night, she stayed up, terrified and watching the window. At around 3 a.m., she saw him again, now in the abandoned house's window. Suddenly, the window shattered and the man stepped through. Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The man was already in her room. The next morning, neighbors found her house empty, with a note reading, "I see you." The room that wasn't meant to be. There was an old house at the edge of town, sitting far from any main road. But it wasn't the house itself that frightened people. It was the room. This room was located on the second floor, at the very end of a long, narrow hallway. The room had no door. Inside, there was nothing but a dark emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. The few who had ventured near it spoke of a strange weight in the air, a pressure they couldn't explain. But it was when the sun went down that the room truly came alive. For years, the house sat abandoned. The town forgot about it, until one day a man named Daniel moved in. The house was old, yes, but it had character. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start, far from the noise of the city and the complications of his past. The first few nights were uneventful. Daniel spent his time unpacking, cleaning, and getting used to the silence of the house. It was peaceful, calm, like a blank slate. But then, on the fourth night, something happened. It started with a sound. At first it was faint, like the creaking of old wood settling. The dragging sound came from upstairs, from the second floor. The sound of something or someone moving through the house. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of his footsteps on the old wooden floors. He reached the top of the stairs and walked slowly down the hallway toward the end, where the room was. The air felt colder here, thicker somehow. Just as his fingers brushed against the edge of the frame, the darkness in the room deepened. It seemed to pull in all the light around it, leaving him surrounded by nothing but a cold, oppressive void. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his feet were frozen in place. The door wasn't just an object, it was a presence, an invitation. And though Daniel knew better, he found himself stepping toward it. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the room, the dragging sound. Closer now, like something was moving toward him. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Daniel went back upstairs. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to go to that room. The moment he crossed the threshold, everything changed. Inside, the room wasn't empty. There was something in the dark, a figure, standing motionless in the center. And then the whispers started. The weight of the air was crushing him. And then the whispers stopped. And then, in the stillness, the door slammed shut. It was a slow, creaking sound, like the house itself was waking up. The darkness inside the room seemed to stretch out, eager to consume anything that entered. Next morning, Daniel was gone. Townspeople spoke in hushed tones about his disappearance, but no one dared to go near the house. The house still stands, empty and abandoned, waiting for the next person to walk through its door. And if you listen closely, on the darkest of nights, you might hear the whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. "We've been waiting for you,"